Welcome to the Present History Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a little bit of a warning before this video podcast episode gets underway. We had a few technical difficulties with the sound, with the microphone and the recording. So my questions do sound a little bit off. I have since re-recorded all my questions for the audio podcast. So if you want to hear my voice in much higher quality, you can go check it out on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. But Annie's answers, they are all just the same quality, just as perfect as they would be in the audio. So that's the main thing anyway. So please do enjoy this episode of the Present History Podcast, and please accept our deepest apologies for some sound trouble. Welcome to the Present History Podcast. This is the second part of our fascinating conversation with Annie Whitehead. So if you haven't already, make sure to check back and listen to part 1 so you can kind of know what's going on. But if you have already, sit back and enjoy. So all of that is so fascinating. I've been interested in the Anglo-Saxon period for a while now, and especially Aethelflaed. So it's just all fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think the Anglo-Saxons, for me, it's the characters. They are so individual, and I find them so distinguishable, which I think a lot of people find difficult. But you know, I can be writing something about 4 different characters, all called Aethelwald, and I know who they are. I just think certainly they're very strong characters, you know, and individuals. So where the names aren't confusing, where you've got the likes of Penda and Offa and Godiva, they're one-offs, really.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the better known Mercian rulers is Aethelflaed, someone you mentioned earlier. Could you tell us a little bit more about her?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I say yes. What's really fascinating about her life is that we seem to know her so well, and yet there's very little information about her. So we know that she was King Alfred's eldest child. Asa tells us that, and say he was a contemporary living in King Alfred's court. So we have to take most of what he says as true. But he leaves out huge details. Like, for example, he doesn't actually name Alfred's wife. He tells us who she is, that she was a Mercian. He tells us where they got married, but he doesn't actually ever mention her by name, which is incredible. But we know that Aethelflaed was the eldest child. We're not sure when she was born, probably 869, 870, something like that. There's a thought that she might initially have been brought up elsewhere. This is an interpretation of something that Asa says about the younger children of Alfred were at all times brought up at the royal court. So the inference might be that that wasn't necessarily true of the older children. It's not a lot to go on. If Aethelflaed had been brought up elsewhere, Mercia is the obvious place because her mother was Mercian. If she was there as a young child, I think she probably came back when the Vikings arrived at Repton. Her uncle, King Burgred of Mercia, was forced to flee. So if she had been there, then I think she would have gone home. So we have to assume that she was aware of her father's struggles with the Vikings, even as a young child. In 878, there was an attack at Chippenham. So if Aethelflaed had been there when her father then had to escape to the marshes in Athelney, it's possible that she was with him, and so grew up with all this fear and awareness of what was going on. As probably a teenager, then she was married to Aethelred, Lord of the Mercians. We have to assume he was a fair bit older than her. So he wasn't a king of Mercia. That was King Burgred, who had to flee. He was probably the last king. There was another one, Ceolwulf, who seems to have been working with Alfred for a while. We don't know what happened to him. So Aethelflaed wasn't a king. So we have to assume, therefore, that he was of an age where he'd already proved himself as a tried and trusted warrior in order to be elected leader of the Mercians. And he was helping Alfred in London to get London back into English control. And around about that point, Aethelflaed was married to him. So this wasn't a love match. This was a diplomatic, political alliance, really. And she then became Lady of the Mercians. And for a long time, her husband, her father, and then subsequently her younger brother, Edward, who became known as Edward the Elder, were fighting together, working as a sort of triumvirate against the Vikings, and they're named in the sources as working together. And then Aethelred disappears from the records. Round about 902, there are a few things going on where you'd expect him to be named because he had been, and suddenly he's not. And so there's battles going on where in the past he would have been mentioned and he's not. And then when we look to outside of the English sources, particularly the Irish chronicles, there's a fragmentary annal which is a little bit untrustworthy but full of detail. When we look at what they say and basically the absence of a reference to Aethelred, it does seem clear that round about 902 he fell ill and was incapacitated enough to no longer be able to be fighting. And it seems like around about this point Aethelflaed took over. And we are told, for example, when the Vikings were in Chester causing trouble, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just says Chester was restored. It doesn't say by whom. If we turn to the Irish Chronicle, I mean, it's more like a saga really than a chronicle. It gives us lots of detail, and in that it talks about Aethelred being on the point of death and directing Aethelflaed. So it's almost like it's his campaign strategy, but he's physically unable to go there, and so she's sort of deputizing for him. Now that in itself is incredible. He died in 911, and what's even more incredible is that she then became the leader of Mercia. So the Mercian Council obviously elected her. They were quite happy to be led by a woman. Her brother, who was King of Wessex by this point, King Edward, also seemingly happy to let her rule. Maybe that at that point he was being stretched a little bit too thinly, because you have to wonder, why didn't he just steam in and take over himself? And it may be that he wasn't able to at that stage. But brother and sister then worked together very strategically to push the Vikings back. So gradually regaining territory, regaining, there's the 5 towns are known as the 5 boroughs, really strategically important. So the likes of Lincoln and Stamford, I can never remember all 5 of them. But just pushing back, and it looks, when you look at their strategy of pushing and the borough building, the boroughs being these fortified towns that they built, it is very strategic. So, brother will be building to allow sister to push back, and then sister will build and consolidate to allow brother to make further gains. So it was, really working in harmony. And as I say, obviously happy for her to lead. I don't think she ever fought. A lot of people do call her a warrior woman, and she has that reputation. There's no evidence. If you look at the things, she sent an army into Wales, she regained Derby, but doesn't actually say at any point that she was fighting. She may have done, I don't know. I'm not convinced. And then 918, she died at Tamworth in a position of strength. The people of York had actually come to her asking for her protection against a new wave. So the Danes, who'd been the bane of Alfred's life, really, were by this point starting to settle and integrate. But there was the new wave, the Norse kings, the Norse coming over from Dublin, and they appealed to Aethelflaed for help. And she actually entered into a tripartite alliance, and then sadly died. And again, the most astonishing thing, I think, of the whole story is that, albeit briefly, she was succeeded by her daughter, which means that a woman was succeeded by a woman ruler. And that didn't happen again in England until Tudor times. So it didn't last long, as I say, because 6 months after that, Edward then did go in and take over. The various reasons for this, I think one, if he wasn't able to earlier and had wanted to, now he had adult sons. The Vikings had been pushed back, so he was in a better position to take over. So I think that's one element. But he was clearly happy to work with his sister. So I do wonder whether her daughter was perhaps not quite of the same caliber. That maybe Edward wasn't prepared to work with her like he had with his sister. But the remarkable thing is that the Mercian Council elected her daughter. They were, having been led by one woman, they were happy to be led by another. And I think there are a number of occasions, even going in further into the 10th century, where the Mercian Council elected a different king. So there was this stubborn streak of independence, even though they were no longer a kingdom themselves. I don't think they were ever really happy to be the junior partner of Wessex. So we've got this incredible situation, woman leader, followed by a woman leader, Mercians happy for that to be the situation. And I just think it's incredible, but we piece this information together through a tiny contemporary source, which is it's known as the Mercian Register. It's been incorporated into the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, but what survives only charts the years 902 to 918. And there it talks very much about the borough building programme. But it does talk about her daughter being deprived of rightful authority. So, I mean, this is a chronicle that's been produced in Mercia by Mercians, and it's saying very definitely she was the rightful leader, she had the authority, and Edward's, steamed in and taken over. So, but that's all we have, really. As I say, just piecing together the little bits and pieces of her life from these various sources. There's really not very much, and it's so strange. She's not mentioned by name in the main Anglo-Saxon chronicle. She's only ever mentioned as Edward's sister. But that main chronicle is being written in Wessex. It's almost like a court chronicle for Edward. So obviously they're going to play that down, and that's the bias that I was talking about earlier. So we have this strange situation. We've got this incredible female leader. This is, almost unique, and yet hardly mentioned in the sources. And you think, well, if it was so unusual, why didn't they mention that it was unusual? It's almost like, yeah, this thing happened and it was huge and it hadn't happened before and it didn't really happen again. But also, yeah, it's not going to happen again. So why not make a point of saying it was unusual? It's a mystery. And I think that's what I really love about her story, is that it's so strong and yet we know so little about the circumstances.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. It's fascinating. So this Mercian willingness and acceptance of female leadership, was that unique compared to the other Saxon kingdoms?
Pretty much, yeah. She was certainly the longest ruling. There were a couple of other incidents. There was one Queen of the West Saxons who is actually mentioned in the regnal lists, so that the lists of monarchs that were compiled. But if she ruled in her own right, it was only for a couple of years. One of the later Anglo-Norman chroniclers said that the West Saxons refused to go to war under her leadership. And looking at it a bit more closely, it does seem to have happened at a time when the kingdom was in, not revolt, but the kingship was disputed. And it's possible that this lady, Saxborough, was actually fighting as a regent for her son's right to rule. But as I say, she was mentioned in the regnal lists. So technically, yes, a queen, but if so, only for a couple of years, and it would seem it didn't end well. There's no other examples. There was a Queen Aethelflaed who's mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, razing Taunton to the ground. We don't have any other information. We don't know why she did, but she wasn't a queen in her own right. Again, it might be that she was fighting on behalf of a son, because women did that an awful lot. So yeah, no, Aethelflaed I think was unique.
Wow.
Apart from her daughter, obviously,
Yes.
because had Edward not taken her, then she wouldn't have been. So.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. And something you mentioned there was the women fighting on behalf of their sons. There's this accepted idea that the Vikings had their shield maidens, and women fought with their husbands or their sons or whatever it was. Was this something in Saxon culture as well, that the women would potentially go to battle with the men or fight for them?
I'm not sure that there's any evidence for that. Again, I know there's a lot of research going on at the moment, particularly in terms of the Viking warrior women, the shield maidens. So I'm looking at all that with interest. I'm not sure there's much, if any, evidence that Anglo-Saxon women did. The huge examples that we know of women really going all out on behalf of their sons, the women tended to play a different game. And a famous example is the tussle after Canute's death between his two wives, so Elfheva of Northampton, who I mentioned earlier, and Queen Emma, who famously was married first to Canute and then to Aethelred the Unready. And these two women set about a huge, well, it's a propaganda war, essentially. So really slating each other in letters, and a famous document, the Encomium Emmae Reginae, which Emma commissioned to tell her story. And it's a real, I always call it the first work of spin, because it is pure propaganda. It completely airbrushes her second husband out of the picture. It is written on basically to strengthen her son's claims to the throne. And it's really a wonderful work. And go back to something we were talking about earlier, again, literacy. I think for Emma to have commissioned this work of propaganda, I think she would have wanted to read it herself. So I think that's probably an indication that she too was literate. But yeah, these two women really, went at it, a huge war of words, and they were sort of adept at extricating themselves from difficult situations by making promises that they weren't necessarily going to keep. It's a fascinating story, and just one really good example of how the women would work, not necessarily needing to wield swords, because they had other weapons in their arsenal. There was a famous 7th century queen who, again, we're not told her name, the wife of King Redwald, who was, we assume, the the missing body in the Sutton Hoo burial. And Redwald had been on a little trip down to Kent. He was the King of East Anglia, and he'd come back and he'd decided to take on this new religion. He was going to convert to Christianity because that's what the Kings of Kent were doing. And the Kings of Kent had lots of links with the continent. So they were, the sort of role model. They were the people to copy and to emulate. And with this lovely story of King Redwald, I always imagine him coming back sort of really jolly and sort of whistling a happy tune and telling his wife that he'd converted. And she essentially said, no, you haven't. And that was that. And he changed his mind. And I said, we don't know her name. But she obviously, she literally had the king's ear. And she had this influence, and she didn't like the fact that he'd committed. There's another story too about how at the time he was giving shelter to an exiled Northumbrian king, and some assassins came to do away with him. And again, she was instrumental in persuading her husband not to let this happen. And we get all this from Bede, it's interesting again that he gives us this story about this powerful pagan woman. So, we have to give it a bit of credence. But I find it a fascinating story about how these women were, they weren't necessarily prepared to just sit down quietly and let the men get on with things.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And this is something that you've written about elsewhere as well in your book, Women of Power in Anglo-Saxon England. Where would you place Aethelflaed in amongst the other women? How does she stand among other female figureheads and rulers?
As an anomaly, really. I think, as I was saying earlier, she is almost unique in actually being the designated leader of a kingdom, and whether she fought or whether she didn't, she ruled in her own name. Not as a queen. The Welsh and the Irish annals actually do call her a queen, and the word queen is a little difficult because it doesn't quite necessarily always mean what we take it to mean. And you've got some kings consorts who were named queen, and some who weren't, and some who witnessed charters and some who didn't. But she was called the Lady, and that was a really important title. Her mother was remembered as the Lady of the English. So again, not queen, but a very important title. But Aethelflaed is an anomaly because, as I say, apart from her daughter, there are no other examples. What we've got, the history of the women's story, I mean, a lot of them aren't named in the main Anglo-Saxon chronicle, so you have to go fishing, and a lot of them were venerated, so their lives were written, so we've got the life of St. Mildred or whoever, and that we get a lot of information from there. We've got powerful queen consorts, we've got powerful abbesses, royal daughters, royal wives, royal sisters, all wielding power in their own way. But Aethelflaed is, as I say, an anomaly because she's the only one, apart from that West Saxon queen, who actually ruled a country in her own right. In her own right, again, technically, perhaps a lot of the charters were, the land grants were with Edward's permission, but she and her husband did issue charters in their own name on their own. So they had a degree of autonomy, but this idea that she ruled, as a widow, so not alongside a man, as a lot of the others did. I mean, Offa's wife, Cynethryth, was part of his ambition to establish this dynasty and have his son anointed while he was still alive. And Cynethryth actually had coins minted in her own name, which, as far as we know, is unique. We haven't found any others. It doesn't mean they're not out there somewhere. But so she's another one who's very, very powerful. And Alcuin, who was the Northumbrian at Charlemagne's court, wrote letters to her son, and basically he said, give my regards to your mother. I know she's too busy with state matters to write back herself. It was that kind of, so she's there, she's in government, but all the time alongside her husband. And when he died, she then retired to an abbey. You know, she actually witnessed charters while her son was in his minority. So again, probably acting as regent. And you see this a lot with powerful widows of kings who then act as regents for their sons, and there's lots and lots of examples of those, but not ruling in their own name, you know, without a son to follow them. And as I say, in that, Aethelflaed was unique.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about the other women that you talk about in that book?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's over 100. Which when I started, I thought, well, you know, are there enough stories here? And I flicked through the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and I think the women are mentioned by name fewer than 50 times in the period that we're looking at. But lots and lots of powerful queens who, by and large, were already daughters of kings. Because in the early period, kings married kings' daughters. They didn't really marry the nobility. So it was royals marrying royals. And a lot of times you get the so-called peace weaver brides traveling hundreds of miles, which, you know, it's so easy to write, oh yes, you know, this lady was a daughter of the King of Kent and she married the King of Northumbria. You know, that's such a simple sentence to write. But that is a journey of hundreds of miles. The expectation on them was huge. One particular lady, who was the daughter of a King of Kent, was written to by the Pope, and he sent her personal gifts and also asked her to help and encourage her husband to convert to Christianity and to then convert the people of Northumbria. So again, a very, very important role that she played. She probably had absolutely no choice in the marriage. You know, they didn't have a lot of say. There were laws that Anglo-Saxon women did not have to marry people that they didn't want to marry. But I don't think this necessarily applied to the daughters of kings, you know, who were there really to make these political alliances. So they travelled hundreds of miles. They, you know, as we touched on before, wielded incredible power in their own way, you know, either through propaganda or persuading their husbands that actually this course of action is not, you know, ideal. They also were keepers of the royal archives. So King Kenwulf, I mentioned earlier, his daughter became abbess of Winchcombe, and this was a repository of the royal archives. And she was an incredibly powerful lady. She was one of the ones who locked horns with the church at Canterbury, trying to keep hold of all her estates. So they were hugely wealthy, very powerful in their own way, and also a lot of them suffered at the hands of, more often than not, the later Anglo-Norman chroniclers. So these, you know, the embellishments that I was talking about, and this particular lady, William of Malmesbury, told a story of her about how she contrived to have her younger brother murdered. I don't see how it can be true, because we don't even have any evidence that this younger brother ever existed. But there's a lurid tale about how she contrived to have him murdered, and then when she was discovered, her eyeballs spontaneously fell out. And it's a story I mention a lot because it is literally fantastic. So yeah, King Edgar's third wife, well, actually I think probably his second wife, I don't believe his first wife existed, but that's a whole other story. She was accused variously of, this is a wonderful story, she decided to murder an abbot who'd seen her dancing provocatively with horses. I think she was naked at the time as well. And so she arranged to have him stabbed under his armpits so the wounds wouldn't show. She was accused of witchcraft. She was very famously accused of murder. So her stepson, Edward the Martyr, who was murdered at Corfe, which happened to be one of her homes. And it is perfectly possible in that instance that it was her supporters who killed him. So, you know, she really suffered. She had a really bad reputation. But when you go digging further into her life, she was the first consecrated queen, it said. You know, so when her husband was crowned, she was crowned beside him. And we have details of that coronation day in a life of a bishop who actually was her enemy. So again, you look at the bias and you think, well, okay, they're saying that she was a legitimate queen. We're going to take their word for it. She was actually asked to intervene in law cases. She actually spoke up on behalf of women in litigation. So there's this whole different side, and that was fascinating about digging up these stories about these women. Yes, they were accused of various crimes, almost always by the much later and less contemporary chroniclers, but actually they were wielding power, they were influencing decisions, they were fighting on behalf of their sons, and they were literate, and they were speaking up for other women in law cases. So there was this whole other side to their lives, which is, yeah, maybe not as lurid and spectacular, but, you know, more impressive and, for me, more interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And these women's, like you say, they were powerful and they were formidable, and they subvert this idea of weakness or subservience in the medieval world. How important do you think it is that these stories are brought to light and told?
Oh, massively, massively. I think if you leave their stories out, then by and large, what you're left with is an image of a warrior society, which is not untrue. You know, it's the same of any age, really. You know, people went to war, and by and large, it was the men who went to war. But if you put the women's stories back in, you get a rounder, more nuanced picture. Not just of the sort of political history, but of society. So if you look carefully at the details, you will find, for example, that we know, going right back to 7th century B tells us that the women had their own households. And St. Wilfrid famously went to the Queen for sponsorship rather than the king. So they had separate households. We've got some surviving wills from noble women that give us huge amounts of details about how noble women lived during these times. And again, we find that they had books. So presumably, again, they were literate. They were, again, making huge bequests to, you know, leaving their land to whom they chose. And this was a right of women. The land that they took into a marriage was theirs to keep. So you get a much broader picture, I think, of society as a whole, and you realise that it isn't all, you know, warfare and swords clashing, that there's a lot of diplomacy and clever operating going on. And as I say, if you look at the women's stories, you get a much better picture of what was going on in society as a whole.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you also write historical fiction as well as non-fiction. How do you go about blending fact and fiction? What does your creative process look like?
It starts with again a story, a character. So I mean, even going back to student days, there were certain people whose stories I wanted to tell in fiction. So it'd be somebody who appeals to me, or a particular period of time that fascinates, and then I really research. And it was actually interestingly, because I got back into the history through writing, and my independent research was actually partly what was enabling me to be elected as a member of the Royal Historical Society. It was actually the research that I'd done. So I do take the research for fiction very seriously. But it's so In fiction, you can, in non-fiction, you can say this happened. You know, as I said earlier, this particular queen started life in Kent and travelled to Northumbria, and so the fiction is, well, how was that for her? How did that feel? Yes, this happened, but why did it happen? What was the family dynamic? So I try to build the people up as real characters, you know, almost sort of breathe the life back into them, if you like, and take it from there. And I try never to mess about with timelines. Just very occasionally I might move a death 6 months here or there, but I try to stick to the known facts and then just fill in the gaps as plausibly as I can. So it's not non-fiction. I am taking, you know, artistic license, but it's my sort of imaginings of what was really going on in the lives of these people. That's what I try to do.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's fascinating. So, The Last Kingdom. You probably get asked about this all the time, but The Last Kingdom. What do you think of it? How does it rank?
I mean, it's a great story. I just put that out there. Bernard Cornwell writes a brilliant story. The translation to TV, I think in some ways wasn't quite as successful. And I know I've got a lot of fellow authors and historians who don't like that they got a lot of the historical detail wrong. The square shields was, you know, caused a bit of apoplexy.
Yeah.
But I think essentially, certainly Aethelflaed's character is very similar to how I envisaged her. What I don't like is the portrayal of the Mercians, because they come across as very weak. Aethelred particularly, he's portrayed, certainly in the TV series, as a young, very callow man. He wasn't. He was a lot older than her. He was much more successful militarily, and he was, I think, a much lovelier bloke all round. There's a lot that stretches credulity. So they've got in the series Aethelflaed's mother still being alive 20 years after she died. You know, so, but it's very interesting because I watch it, I go, that didn't happen. You know, Sihtric of York wasn't a Dane, he was Norse. But somebody who doesn't know the period as well will absolutely love the series. And I think anything that gets people interested in and talking about this period, it can only be a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
Sure, absolutely. So as a final question, a bit more of a light-hearted one, well, depending on how you choose to interpret it, what is something that you tell your younger self about the study of history or writing history that you've now learned?
I would say dig deeper.
Sure.
That's something. When I started writing fiction, I knew all the political history. But what I didn't know was simple things like, what did they have for breakfast? Did they have breakfast? What were their mealtime habits? So I had to sort of start again and look at all the social history and try to find out more about the ordinary people and how they lived and worked. So there's that. I would also say to my younger self, ask more about the women.
Sure. Because
back when I was studying, the women's history, the women's stories were not being talked about as much as they are now. I mean, now women's history is really, you know, a hot topic. So that's great. One thing I have learned really recently is, and I would, again, if I could go back, I'd do it differently, is even though during my A-levels, I studied European history and looking at all the different European countries and how they interacted and the connections, but I didn't necessarily, when I was an undergrad, do that with Anglo-Saxon English history.
Sure.
And now I'm finding that I'm equally fascinated by Welsh medieval history, Irish medieval history, the formation of the kingdom of what we now know as Scotland. And actually, there's an awful lot of interaction. I'm currently writing a piece for a new book that's coming out about King Adred.
Wow.
And it's impossible to talk about his reign without looking at what was going on in so-called Viking Northumbria. So I'm sort of, researching much more around the subject than you perhaps do when you're younger and sort of being told almost what to study and what to look at. So yeah, I think I would just say dig deeper, ask more questions, and read all around as much as you can.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic advice. Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Present History podcast. If you'd like to find out more about Annie and her work, you can check out her website at anniewhiteheadauthor.co.uk, and you can follow her on Twitter at AnnieWHistory. All the links will be in the description as well. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure to follow us on all social media platforms so you can keep up to date with everything we're up to. And we'll see you next time on the Present History podcast.